Welcome to Precinct 444, the podcast where we explore the issues shaping law enforcement today. I'm your host, Josh Bronson, Director of Education, Programs, and Visitor Experience at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. In this episode, The Power of Mindfulness, Building Resilience in Law Enforcement, we're diving into the transformative power of mindfulness for officer wellness. Joining me today is Dr. Jenn Rineer from RTI International, a leading researcher working on a variety of topics within law enforcement, working to better support the public safety community to improve officers' experience of work and occupational health in the public safety community. Jenn is also a trained mindfulness facilitator. Together, we'll unpack how mindfulness can help officers manage stress, improve decision-making under pressure, and build resilience for the long haul. Thank you for being here today, Jenn. Let's dive right in.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you could join for the conversation. I think this is a really important and powerful conversation. I know in my time as a police officer and, and then after, I wish I had known more about this topic, prior to leaving the law enforcement profession. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this today and break down just what is mindfulness. So I think that's actually a really great place to start. How would you define mindfulness? We've talked a lot about, I've mentioned the word mindfulness multiple times now, but how do you define mindfulness?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Josh. So the definition of mindfulness and what mindfulness is, it's a lot simpler, I think, than what people sometimes think. That doesn't mean that it's easy to practice or to do necessarily, but mindfulness is really just our ability as humans to have present moment awareness. In other words, just to notice what is happening right now, right in front of you in your mind and your body, right? John Kabat-Zinn, who, was one of the leaders of mindfulness practice, who brought the practice, sort of into the non-religious realm and really popularized it in the United States, defines it as paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So that's the part also that is, I guess, simple but not easy, right? It's sort of focusing on your direct experience without also telling yourself a whole story about it, right? Like something that you like or dislike, or, necessarily attaching memories or plans to things. It's just what is happening right now. That's really what mindfulness is.
That's a really great and helpful definition, I think, because it really frames the conversation, I think, in a way that is helpful for law enforcement. So many times in policing and in law enforcement and public safety, you don't stop and sort of acknowledge what's happening in a moment, right? You're running from call to call to call. You're, dealing with people on their worst day, the worst day of their lives, and so we never sort of take that moment to step back and sort of, okay, what is actually happening? How am I feeling? What's going on in my head? And I think that's, something we need to do more of.
Absolutely. I think it's helpful for police officers and really for anyone. And, I should say before we continue, I wanted to say a couple things about what mindfulness isn't, because I think there's a lot of misperceptions about what it is and, just the way that it's talked about in the media and popular press. I think sometimes people have this vision. I think I used to think this before I learned more about it, that you're supposed to be calm when you're mindful, right? It's like this Zen state where you're calm or you're clearing your head of thoughts, right? Like you're just trying to sort of be in this very calm, peaceful, floating on a cloud-like state, right? It's really not that at all. I don't even know if that's possible. One of the things I love about mindfulness is it's not about trying to change anything, right? If you have thoughts in your head, it's not necessarily about trying to push those away. It's not about, trying to change your thoughts into something else. It's just being more aware. And so I think people think, oh, there's no way I could sit still and just be silent and like silence my mind. And I agree that probably is impossible, but that's not really what it is, right? It's just like having more awareness. Okay, so a question I'm going to throw back to you. So we just defined what mindfulness is, and I know you know a fair amount about what mindfulness is. If that's mindfulness, how would you define meditation?
Ooh, that's a tough question. So, I guess in my mind, it's meditation is almost the practice of mindfulness. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is exactly what you were just talking about, actually, is what mindfulness isn't too. And how when you are engaged in something like meditation, people do have this preconceived notion. I know I did, of this preconceived notion where you're, sitting there, and, again, stereotypically, in a monastery somewhere and, those sorts of things. But um, what I've come to learn is that it really is about when a thought pops into your head while you're practicing meditation or, doing yoga or, any of these sorts of things, it's about acknowledging that thought, like actually being present with that thought and letting it take its course, run its course. And in doing that, I feel like relating it back to law enforcement, that's where I really wish I had known more about what mindfulness was and meditation in my law enforcement career, because there are so many times when I can look back and say, I don't know what was happening. It wasn't that I wasn't in control of the situation. I mean, we talk about being in control of a situation in law enforcement a lot, and but it's being in control of yourself. I think that is one of the more important aspects that where this can really sort of play a significant role.
Yes, I love that response. And, for the listeners out there, I did not tell Josh I was going to ask him that question in advance. And that answer was spot on, right? So mindfulness is just our ability to be aware in the present moment. And then exactly like you said, meditation is that more formal practice of, either doing a sitting meditation or sometimes it's a walking meditation. A lot of yoga, yoga and mindfulness are very intertwined. So a yoga practice is a meditation practice of sorts. And, my meditation teacher used to say, people don't meditate because they want to become good meditators. People meditate because they want something in their lives to change, right? So the purpose of sitting down to meditate or engaging in that more regular, meditation practice is to make it easier to be more in the present moment in your daily life, no matter what you're doing, right? So you can be mindful in any moment or situation, right? If you just notice, here's what's coming up for me, or you're really present and engaged when you're talking to somebody, that's mindfulness. And then meditation is just the practice that makes it easier for those moments to happen in your daily life. So great answer,
Josh. No, that's really interesting though, because I think what people, I know, again, in my experience, before I started down the path of more understanding it more, I didn't acknowledge that. And one of the things that I've tried to learn is that I can practice it at home like I do, but then you also practice it throughout your daily life where, if somebody cuts you off while you're driving, like that's the perfect example for me because I have terrible road rage. Not active, like violent road rage or anything, but I get very angry, typically when somebody cuts me off or something or weaves around you especially because I can't do anything about it now, right? Because I'm not a police officer anymore. So it's that loss of control. But one of the things through practicing mindfulness and meditation is acknowledge, like when those feelings come up for me now, I'm better. It doesn't always work. It's not 100% of the time, but I'm better able to realize that that's happening. Let myself have that moment of anger, frustration, whatever it is, and then sort of breathe it away and then go on with my life. Because at the end of the day, in the big scheme of things, it's not really that big a deal. And that to me has been one of the most noticeable differences, and how I've been able to navigate, learning about mindfulness and meditation.
Thank you for that example. Yeah, that is a perfect example of just how this can look in someone's daily life. And I know for me, one of the reasons I got more serious about my mindfulness practice is, I have 2 young kids, and about a year or 2 ago, I just started noticing that in interacting with them, I'd be like on a walk with them around my neighborhood or like playing a game with them. And I was realizing, like, in my mind, I'm not even here, right? Like I'm sitting here doing the things, or I'm going on a walk doing the things, but it's like, in my mind, I was totally somewhere else, like trying to solve a work problem or, thinking about some relationship issue that I was having or just anywhere else except for like focusing on what was right in front of me that could have been a really positive experience. And it's like, it really started to bother me because it's like, one of the things I care about most is being a good parent and being present for my kids and just realizing like, I'm just not here. And I know, I've been doing research with law enforcement for years now. And I know that this is really common. I mean, among people in general, but in law enforcement, especially, right? It's like you're running through these things that happen throughout the day, really serious things. And, that's normal, but it's like, I think what mindfulness provides is just the opportunity to, just like you said, be more aware of what's happening in your mind so that you have a little bit more control over where your attention is, right? Because I think we can all relate to the feeling of like, you have this story going in your head, or you're replaying something over and over, and you don't necessarily want that to be what your mind is doing, right? Like you want to be engaging with something else, with someone else. And so to me, that's one of the things that's so powerful about mindfulness is just giving you a little bit more of that control back around having your mind be where you want it to be.
Well, and I love that point too, because control, I think that's something that law enforcement, we understand very well, right? Is, we always have to be in control, and I'm not saying that is a bad thing, right? We need to have control over a situation because, if somebody's going to jail, we don't want them to hurt themselves or anybody else or us, right? We need to have control over that situation. So I don't say that as a negative, but it is true that we like to have control over a situation. And I think one of the things that, in my mind, is, really shifting that conversation of what does control actually look like? What does power actually look like? And, I love the idea of mindfulness in that example you get, because it shifts that sort of narrative around control, right? If you want to be in control of yourself as a police officer, if you want to understand what's happening to you better, then, this is a great way to do that, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for explaining it that way.
Well, and, I think one of the things that is always interesting to me too is, the science behind things. Why do things happen? Why does the brain work this way? And, that's always of interest to me. I'm sure it is to others as well. I wonder if you'd be able to share with us any, background, any information that you can about why does this work even? What is the science behind it?
Yeah, thank you. So in preparing to talk to you about this today, I did a little bit more research. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar. I mean, there's a lot of research out there, which is
Yeah.
a good thing. It's a good thing. And when we post maybe the description of this episode, we can put some links in for people who want to read up more a little bit about this, especially
Yeah.
about the research in law enforcement specifically. I mean, there's been some pretty powerful research that shows that, I mean, what we're talking about here really is changing the thought pathways that we normally have. That's one of the ways that mindfulness changes the brain. And I mean, you may have heard, a lot of people may have heard, I mean, there have been studies that even show like the physiology of the brain can change after a lot of continued practice. I mean, I think you have to meditate quite a bit for the structure of your brain to change, but that is a real thing that's been established in a lot of studies, right? And one of the things that it does is, it bolsters the parts of your brain that help you do more advanced thinking, right? We have those systems that just are sort of like the fight, flight, automatic reaction without getting too much in the weeds of the science, and then those parts of our brain for higher thinking. And it really strengthens those parts of our brain that are needed for higher thinking and for decision making and things like that. Some of the other things that mindfulness has been shown to affect is the nervous system, right? So it does improve kind of along the same lines, like that parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest and digest mode, rather than the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. And I mean, just to put that in like basic English, right? It's like we know how so many of us, and especially those of you in law enforcement, it's like you're walking around with just like a baseline elevated level of stress all the time, right? So then I'm sure all of us can relate to this idea of, something happens in your environment that is kind of like you're talking about with the traffic, right? It's like something happens that is not necessarily a life and death, like huge, big deal thing, but our body reacts in a way that it is a huge deal, whether it's something that your spouse says, or, it's some relatively minor thing. It's like our body just has this really amped up reaction. And so what mindfulness practice does is it puts a pause between the event that's happening, the way that our body reacts, and then how we interpret that. So like you said earlier, it's really about like being aware of what's happening, so that instead of just getting really pissed off and sort of, maybe saying something you don't want to say, you still have the feelings that come up initially. Some of that we can't control, but it's about being able to have that pause in there so that you can take that breath and just think a little bit more about what you're doing and realize, like, okay, this is one of the things that I can let go. And you can save your energy for the things that really do require more of that serious reaction, right? Some of the other, science behind mindfulness, there have been a lot of studies that show, improved attention based on mindfulness practice. So, mindfulness really is sort of attention training, right? We're paying attention to where our attention goes, and we're training ourselves to be able to have more control over that. I asked you what meditation is, but I didn't really talk too much about what that looks like. So some of for people who haven't done much of the practice yet, often it is, just trying to keep your attention on your breath, right? So just, as thoughts and feelings pop up, like you said, being aware of those, not necessarily trying to change them, but just kind of gently bringing your attention back to the breath. There are other things that you can use as anchors, whether it's, the sensation of your hands or your feet, during walking meditation or mindful movement, you're trying to really just keep bringing your attention back to whatever your body is experiencing. But it really is an attention practice, which is super important, obviously, in the policing profession and so many other lines of work, right? It helps you, notice when you're distracted faster, bring your attention back to where it wants to be. In terms of emotion regulation, again, it's not necessarily stopping emotions from coming up. We're not trying to change that, nor can we necessarily, but it helps us relate to them differently. One of the things I loved about learning about mindfulness is like thinking about our thoughts and feelings like the weather, right? It's like the way that the thoughts in your head and the way that you feel, it's a combination of like all sorts of internal conditions, external conditions. These things are always changing, right? So we tend to get really tied up and tied into our thoughts and feelings and identify with them really strongly and maybe get overwhelmed. But when we practice more mindfulness, we notice that these things are always changing, right? And someone once said to me, trying to change your thoughts and feelings is like trying to change the weather. And I really liked that, right? Because it's like we all know how insane that is. And again, mindfulness isn't necessarily about trying to change what we're experiencing. It's just about changing that awareness. There have been some really cool studies, including with police, about benefits for sleep. Police have a lot of challenges with sleep because of the shift work and the kinds of things that they experience during the day. So that's really important. It's also been shown to strengthen immune functioning. And then, we may talk about this more later, but it's also really good for relationships, which obviously helps, in engaging with communities, engaging with coworkers. Just helps to increase empathy and compassion and our ability to listen to each other. So that was a lot that I just said. There's so much more out there. But yeah, really, really powerful effects.
Yeah, you could do a whole podcast on the science of it. It's funny though, when you started talking about breathing, I definitely noticed myself like taking breaths and I became very aware of my breathing. But it's also interesting too, because, the breathing is important and, that's gotten me through a lot of situations and things. But even I noticed, so when I started more long distance running, like my first marathon that I ran, I noticed like that at points I was starting to like, drift away and, to just go someplace else sort of thing. But I noticed I would like rub my fingers together as I was running, and it sort of like grounded me, brought me back to that moment, gave me something to do almost too. But it really made me present in that moment. And it's something as simple as that. Just rubbing your fingers back and forth was really powerful.
I love that. Yeah, that's like your own anchor of attention that you created, right? Like that sensation. And I think that's another great thing about mindfulness is you can use whatever strategies or anchors or whatever you want to call it work for you, and whatever is at your disposal in the moment. And that's one of the reasons why the breath can be very effective, is like you have that with you wherever you go. And same with the strategy you just described, as something that you can, that you can pull to the surface anytime to help you get through something. So that's really smart.
Well, and I'm also reminded too, I worked with a colleague at University of Maryland at one point, and in doing some training on trauma-informed response to sexual assault. one of the things that she would talk about, she was an advocate and a trauma therapist, and um, she would talk about asking survivors, victims, before an interview, if the temperature was okay in the room. And that little, it was a grounding trick, basically. I mean, trick is, I use that loosely, but a grounding exercise, I guess, where it's bringing somebody back into the moment, making them focus on something other than, what it is that is happening. And it's putting them in that headspace where they're now here, they're present. And I thought that always stuck with me too, as another.
Yeah, that's a great strategy, and things like that can make all the difference.
So when we talk about law enforcement, obviously there's a lot of trauma that law enforcement officers face, and until recently, very often has gone unacknowledged. We tend to focus on the large trauma, pretty well within law enforcement. If you go on a particularly horrible car crash and a child dies, for example, those we recognize, and we've done a pretty good job over the years of recognizing those as traumas. But there are a lot of little traumas that law enforcement face on a regular basis that sort of add up, and sort of cumulative trauma. So what about mindfulness, or can mindfulness be used to mitigate those sorts of circumstances?
Yes. So speaking of the research, I mean, there has been research on the utility of mindfulness practice for, helping with symptoms of PTSD or trauma or chronic stress, right? Sometimes people experience all of these things or some of them. It can be very effective. I did want to note before talking about that, though, that one of the things that I felt lucky to learn about in my own mindfulness training is just the importance of teachers of mindfulness and facilitators of mindfulness being trauma informed when working with people who may be experiencing trauma. So, I know you're aware of this. I think, a lot of the more established, even, the more popular apps like Headspace and things like that incorporate language that is trauma sensitive. But I do think, for police agencies that may be wanting to implement mindfulness resources, or even for individuals, it's good to try to see if you can find anything written about how the creator of that product or service does have some sort of background in, trauma-informed practices. Because, I mean, as we mentioned before, I mean, the practice of mindfulness is really about becoming more aware of everything, right? Including our thoughts and feelings. And, a lot of times when people face trauma, whether it's severe trauma or, these smaller traumas, like you're saying, I mean, as a coping mechanism, people often try to push those things away, right? Or ignore them. And sometimes people feel like they have to do that to get through, their work, the next working day, the next call, whatever it is. A lot of times people use, alcohol or other, coping mechanisms that may or may not be super effective, right? To try to kind of push those things away. So if all of a sudden, we're telling people through mindfulness, okay, let's all of a sudden become very aware of all of these thoughts and feelings, right? Which it can involve, kind of like reliving some of these things. Sometimes difficult things pop up that maybe people haven't been dealing with. So it can be very helpful in dealing with it. The other thing is, mindfulness is a very, very helpful practice. It's also not meant to be in place of, doctor provided medical health treatments and things like that. So I think we just have to be a little bit cautious about like where it can provide value, but also put a little bit of like guardrails around that, just because of what can come up in the practice. That said, I mean, I do think, for all of the things that people experience that they may not be dealing with, right? Either because they don't realize how much it's affecting them, or because they sort of push those thoughts and feelings down because they think that that's the best option. I mean, I think we all know, and you all know who have been in the profession, those things tend to pop up at some point, right? Whether it's in small ways through, lack of patience or the way that you interact with people, or sometimes maybe in bigger ways, right? Where eventually you have bigger issues with anxiety or depression when these things come to the surface. I mean, mindfulness really can be helpful for realizing, either after an incident occurs or, even just in your daily life, how these things are affecting you so that you can, have more proactive strategies for managing those things and they don't sort of surprise you later and come out in bigger ways. So I think it's really helpful for that. I think, as I mentioned earlier, like one of the ways that mindfulness works is just by putting that pause or, that space between yourself and your thoughts and realizing like, yes, I have all of these thoughts, but I'm not those thoughts. I'm not those feelings. Those are things that change because often, with trauma and PTSD symptoms, you can have a repetitive loop or recurring memories, and just being able to put a little bit of a distance between yourself and those can be helpful. And then the other thing is, mindfulness really is about, you talked about the thing about like the temperature in the room or the lights or whatever it is. Mindfulness is about grounding in the present, right? So that can be a super effective strategy for, managing symptoms related to, trauma, because you're focusing on what's right in front of you. And it can be helpful for people to realize, okay, that thing that happened, yes, it was very serious. Yes, it had big impacts. It's not happening right now, right? Right now, I am here. I am in this room. These are the things that I see. Like, this is what's going on for me right now. So it can be a very, very helpful strategy. So I guess all that's to say, it can have huge impacts. I think people just need to be a little bit cautious and make sure that they're using resources and services that were developed by people who understand kind of how to do this in the most healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I think one of the things I think that we look for sometimes is that, magic strategy, that will help just fix us, and cure all our problems. And unfortunately, the human brain is much more complex than that. And it often takes a lot of different strategies. But I do think, if someone can start out with understanding, how to live in the present moment and, understand how to acknowledge those thoughts and things, then that's definitely a significant piece of it. And like you said, there are other pieces that, need to be maybe unpacked more, through the help of a therapist or, psychologist, somebody along those lines that's really trained to do that. So don't think that this is like I hope that listeners don't think this is like a strategy that's going to fix all your problems, but it's definitely one that can help moving forward, from the present to moving forward almost. And not to say that it can't help with past, experiences too, that you might come up, and acknowledge, but yeah, definitely, you should be also engaging, some professional help as well. But it is interesting though, the way the brain works around, sort of traumatic situations or situations that maybe we're not used to. I mean, I still remember the very first dead body that I've, came across. It wasn't a homicide or anything like that. He died of natural causes. It was, pretty straightforward. Had a heart attack. But as a police officer, I still remember the first dead body I came across very clearly. I mean, I can picture it, in my mind if I wanted to now, very clearly. The first homicide that was on, was a very violent, it was a double shooting, shotgun, all sorts of stuff I won't go into.
Mm.
Um, but that one, for whatever reason, I don't have the same sort of memories, or, it doesn't. I'm not going to say the first one bothers me to this day or anything, but it definitely was more bothersome at the time,
Mm.
in my career, seeing just a natural cause death as opposed to the homicide. And that's always struck me as interesting too. And I don't know if other people have that same experience in policing. I mean, I know some do, based on conversations that I've had with peers, but that to me has always sort of stuck out as an interesting aspect of trauma and how the brain sort of deals with trauma. And you know sort of wishing that I had known more about mindfulness at the time, but I don't know, it just seems like an interesting part of all of this conversation.
I agree. That is really interesting. And to me, I think what that speaks to from mindfulness that I think could be really relevant to police officer training is that we never really know how things are going to be, right? And how we're going to feel. I think, we spend so much time preparing for certain things, right? And planning for things to be a certain way. And you have to do that and you should, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think also there needs to be attention paid to the kind of thing that you're describing, right? Of like, it might be that for most people, they react the X way to this thing and Y way to that thing. But it's like, we're all, like you said, we're all different, and things stick with us or affect us in different ways for different reasons. And sometimes we might never know why. But I think that's part of it too, is like just accepting that that is the case, and like not having any judgment around that, right? Because I think that's the other thing too, is like in policing, there are so many supports put in place for certain types of critical incidents, right? Or certain types of calls. But there are so many things, like, I don't think it's necessarily that unusual what you're describing, of like this thing that maybe quote unquote should be relatively mundane, really like is striking and kind of like, impacts you. I don't know if you'd call it in a negative way, but like is something that came up for you and had a significant impact. So I think that's a mindfulness like element, I guess, that could be brought into training, is just like acceptance of, we don't really know how these things are going to affect you, and it's really just on each of us to notice how it does impact us, and hopefully be in an organizational environment where we can express if something is impacting us in a negative way, even if it's not like the typical things that maybe one would expect.
Well, and that's a great point. I mean, incorporating this into, training and things for law enforcement as a leader, I would, I always wanted to, and I would suggest to others that, you want to do the best job you can at keeping your people safe and well, right? At the end of the day, that's a really important, probably, I mean, if not the most important, definitely one of the most important parts of being a leader in law enforcement, is making sure that your officers, that those in your care are well taken care of, and supported. And um, I think we don't necessarily talk about those sorts of pieces enough um, in training, especially when we're training leaders. Is, you don't know what's in somebody else's background, right? You don't know what experiences they've had. Um, you don't know how a particular call is going to impact them. Um, and not not coming across as an agency response that is going to be very judgmental, if an officer brings something up to a supervisor, or even to another officer, to a fellow officer. I mean, we're notorious for gallows humor and, making light of, really terrible situations. And that's not a necessarily bad thing. I'm not criticizing that either, because there's a place, and time for that. And it's a coping mechanism that we've built up over the years. But I do think if we incorporated this type of information into police training, to leadership training, to training chiefs when they go through, training to be a chief, not that there's a ton of it, but there is some. I think that could make a real difference in a lot of officers' lives.
I think we just came up with a new training that we need to develop and test. I mean, I'm sort of serious. Like, I mean, imagine if new officers heard the example you just shared of like, listen, I saw, well, I mean, you witnessed tons of things in your career, right? But just comparing the two that you just described, right? And this one where I saw someone who died naturally of a heart attack really impacted me because it was one of the first experiences. I mean, I feel like you could really save a lot of long-term stress and heartache that people might experience from just feeling like, am I weird? Like, is it weird that this shouldn't have bothered me? Like, I shouldn't tell somebody about this. They'll just laugh at me. Like, if we could just kind of change the mindset around that. And I think, I heard you talk about like training for chiefs and upper level leadership, but I think too, sergeants need to be, and like frontline level leadership need to be trained on this sort of stuff, because they're probably the ones that someone would be more likely to go to, right? And maybe it could just be a regular check-in of like, hey, like, has anything affected anybody that like is still kind of, lingering in your mind? Like, just sort of non-judgmentally. I mean, I think that could have a really, really big impact. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about supervisors. So one of the things in one of my previous stops in my career, developing a first line supervisor training. And in that training, I had a chief come in, and she did this really fantastic exercise. And actually, she's going to be on the podcast a couple episodes from now, but to talk about some other things. But she did this really impactful exercise where she had a Jenga basically, and she put a little police officer head at the top of the Jenga, and then gave everybody a little Post-it, just a little sticky note, very small strip, and they had to think about the most difficult call that they'd ever been on, and then write down one word how they felt about that call. So they didn't have to share if they didn't want to, they could share what they wanted to or not, but she encouraged them to at least read out the word, right? And so what they would do then is they'd go up to the Jenga, pull out one of the Jenga bricks and put their little sticky on it. And then
Mhm.
inevitably, it would all topple down. And her point in the exercise was basically like, you never know as a supervisor what other people are dealing with, how they're feeling about a particular incident. And eventually it will make you crumble if you're not sort of dealing with that, all of those little pieces of all these different calls.
Mm.
Um, and so encouraging supervisors to be more attentive to that fact and aware of that fact. And I always found it to be a really powerful example of basically what we were just talking about.
Yeah, that seems like a really compelling activity. It reminds me of, we did through my work at RTI, we had done a project funded by the cops office with Denver PD, and we did a supervisor training with frontline supervisors and
Mhm.
just teaching them how to be more supportive of their employees in various ways. And I mean, one of the things that kept coming up were just these examples of people feeling so relieved when someone else said, especially if someone else in leadership said, hey, like I still have bad dreams about this thing that happened X number of years ago, or just, the willingness to be vulnerable. And so I think, I love what you just said. And it's like the supervisors need to be prepared to, not know how things are going to affect people and kind of to be able to look out for them. And supervisors are also dealing with a lot of
Yeah.
those same things themselves, right?
Mhm.
And, we know that like supervisors role modeling, like the healthy behaviors and, accessing resources and seeking help when they need it, that's good for both the supervisors and for that role modeling to encourage other people to do it. So I don't know. I think we have a mindfulness training for police supervisors on the horizon. That's what I'm
Yeah,
hearing.
hey, there you go. We have an officer safety and wellness program here at the Memorial Fund, so
Hey, hey.
we'll chat. And I think too, you talk about supervisors have things going on, and they're like, chiefs are the same way. Chiefs are
Yes.
notorious for probably being the worst people to acknowledge, that they have things going on. Sort of historically, we haven't done a great job at talking about the stressors that chiefs have, because while they might not be going on the routine sort of call and coming across the dead body or being involved in an officer involved shooting, they have to deal with all of those things happening to all of their officers, and then
Mhm.
whatever stressors they're getting from the outside, the community. And so I think for chiefs and command staff level too, this could be a really powerful training model to implement there as well.
Yeah.
And when it comes to agencies, and sort of what they can do, if anyone out there listening is interested in trying to implement something like this, and to take on having their officers train in mindfulness, are there any programs out there that you're familiar with or anything along those lines that might be useful for chiefs or anyone listening that wants to try to implement something like this?
Yes, I feel like this is sort of similar to the question you asked me about research, where there's lots of stuff out there, and probably
Yeah.
more than listeners want to hear right now. But I will say there. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that you can go with this. I mean, there are apps out there, some
Mhm.
that are law enforcement specific that can be useful, especially if you want to give officers, just sort of the ability to test it out on their own time. I mean, you can get like an agency level, subscription to something like that. I mean, there's Headspace, Calm,
Mhm.
Happier. Insight Timer is another popular app. And I just saw that they have a whole library of free resources for first responders, which
Mm.
is kind of cool. But there are a lot of really great mindfulness instructors out there who can develop something that's really tailored to your agency and your needs. I mean, a lot of the research that's been done is on either in-person or hybrid programs. I mean, I do think there's some benefit to having people practice together, just to kind of have the camaraderie of it, to feel like other people are, kind of in the same program as you. So that can be beneficial as well. But it kind of depends on how much time you have too. I mean, I've seen there's been some research on like roll call kind of programs where it's just a couple of minutes every day, which I think is really interesting. There are also some resources that are on like, IACP's website. There's a mindfulness toolkit for law enforcement, which was developed by IACP and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And they have, some pretty detailed information about like exercises that individual officers can do and things like that. So we can put some descriptions maybe in the description of the episode. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there, and people can also reach out to me directly, and I can help connect you to folks who are doing work in this space who can come talk to your agency about what you'd like to do.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah. And I think sort of along these lines, right, then goes skepticism, because I think that's, as police officers, we're naturally skeptical of pretty much everything, right? And that's not a criticism. In a lot of ways, we need to be skeptical of pretty much everything we come across, because we deal with, a lot of things that general public doesn't, and it's part of our nature. But I do think that in this case, we do need to talk a little bit maybe about how do you overcome that skepticism, within an agency that might be trying to implement something like this. And even just on a personal sort of level, I mean, it's like, I think part of it is just talking about it more, right, and making it part of the culture. But I wonder what you have what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. I mean, people have their perceptions or misperceptions. So I think, there's a few different things to address, right? It's like people might think that it's total BS and not worth it to even try. But then even in agencies or for officers who might be interested, it's like, well, I don't know how to do it or where to go, or like, I don't know if I can fit that into my schedule. That's like a legit thing too, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, and for anyone, we have to make decisions on like, what do we want to prioritize, right? Is it worth the time and effort? I would make a strong plug for just trying it. Like even if you think this is probably really silly, like just try it, because I mean, the thing about mindfulness that is, I would say, so different from like anything else that I've tried to incorporate into my life is like, you really can only experience it by doing it, right? Like you can only get so much benefit from, it's okay. I think it's important to talk about mindfulness, and you can only get so much benefit or learn so much about it from talking about it, right? Like you just have to kind of give it a shot. And I would say, just think about, like we were talking about before, like what it is. It's really about being more aware of what you are doing, what you are experiencing, what is happening to you, so that you have more agency over how you want to respond, how you want to spend your time, like, right? I mean, I think that, again, people can really relate to this. I think we all sometimes wake up and are like, what am I doing? Like, I'm in a crappy mood all the time, or like I'm spending all my time on this thing when really my values are over there, right? Like I know that I've had that realization more than once of like, okay, what are the things I really care about in life, and where is my energy going? And so much of our energy has to do with like the negative thoughts, right, and feelings that we have, right? So I think if you're thinking like, is this for me? I would just like encourage you to ask the question, like, do I want more control about like what is going on in my mind and like how I move through the world? Like that's really what it is about. And then, the other thing I would say is like, one thing for me to talk about it. I mean, I have been doing research with law enforcement, and I know a lot of people in law enforcement. It's not, I don't have that lived experience. You do. So I would say listeners, listen to Josh, because it's maybe more credible in this space from your point of view. But to that end, like talk to other people in law enforcement who practice mindfulness, practice yoga, maybe agencies that have implemented this. Like I've been really encouraged to see like every year at the IACP Officer Safety and Wellness Conference, there are more and more presentations on this topic, talking specifically about like mindfulness-based programs that have been tailored for law enforcement. I believe there are some programs called like mindfulness-based resiliency training, I think, that have been developed specifically for police. So I would go say like, don't take my word for it. Go see like what other law enforcement agencies are doing, and listen to other people who are doing the same job as you, who have some of the same, challenges and experiences and needs and interests, and hear how it's been working for them. Because I think that'll probably give a clearer example.
Well, and, I love what you said, see, part of it, I think, is sort of the unknown and the fear, slash embarrassment almost of doing this, right? And I think that people will be surprised at how many other people within law enforcement are doing something along these lines. Now, whether they call it mindfulness or not, or, yoga or not, or, whatever the case might be, I think more and more people are finding those ways to incorporate some of the techniques into their jobs, into their lives. And I think the more that we're open and honest with each other in law enforcement about what we're doing to keep ourselves well, and it doesn't just have to be lifting a whole bunch of weight in the weight room, or, going for runs, or, whatever the case might be. There are a lot of other ways to improve ourselves and sort of, like you were saying, take control back over our lives, basically. And I think, I mean, I know from experience, I'm very open now with, telling people that I do yoga all the time. But when I first started, and this is even after I was a police officer, I had not been a police officer for years at this point. But the more people I told, even who are still on the job, are like, "Oh yeah, I've been doing that too. It's really great." And it sort of gives people permission to have those conversations. And I think that that's really, you know, at the end of the day, I think that's one of the most powerful things that people can do is acknowledging that there's a different kind of power and a different kind of strength in acknowledging things that might not be, or what you might think are not the norm, right? Because there are more people out there than that are doing these things. I remember when I was on the job, we some of our supervisors, we were made we were made voluntold, I should say,
Uh-huh.
to participate in a yoga class at one point, and we did not take it seriously at all. And it was this big joke with all these big guys, and we were falling all over the place and stuff, and couldn't do it, so we made a joke out of it. But once I started doing yoga and trying to actually incorporate it, it's so hard, it's difficult, it's not easy, and it's really good for building strength. And that's something that I had never known before. And so it changes people in a lot of ways, I think, that people aren't willing to talk about enough, I think.
Yeah, I like so much about what you just said, and that piece too about, like, people probably thought it was silly and we're making a joke out of it, but it's not only, it's either not what people think or it's not only what people think, right? It can be super physically challenging. It can be
Mhm.
as hard of a workout as anything else you
Yeah.
can imagine. And I would say there's a parallel there with mindfulness because, like I said, it's simple, but it's not easy, and it takes a lot. And I think it takes some courage
Mhm.
to try it and to be with yourself and to be with your thoughts and your feelings, and just to be willing to look at that. But I think it really does help you just engage with life in a way that feels more authentic, more aligned with what you want to be doing. I mean, one of the things that I really like from mindfulness is just this idea that for all of us, like, life is a series of ups and downs, right? Like, it's a bumpy road. There's going to be, a lot of really great things and a lot of really hard things that happen. And it's about being able to meet those things in a way that you feel better about, right? It's like trying not to always just push away like the things that are bad, or to like cling on to the things that are good, which we all tend to do all the time. But it's sort of just this acknowledgement of like, yeah, life has a lot of ups and downs, and I'm going to try to be here with it and meet it in like an intentional way, and respond in a way that feels right and feels authentic rather than just like reacting, or trying to push these things down. So I think like I said, I think it takes a lot of courage, just like for you. It took a lot of courage, I think, to revisit that after maybe originally thinking it was kind of a joke, right? And to
Yeah.
add now to be out here talking about it, and how helpful it's been. It takes courage, really. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, at the end of the day, when we're talking about this and sort of, you know, shaping the future of officer wellness programs and policing culture itself, I think that mindfulness really has a significant place in shaping how we move forward. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. How do you see mindfulness sort of shaping those topics within policing?
Yeah, when I think about like the place of mindfulness in like the future of law enforcement wellness, I would love to see it offered in a trauma informed way, like I said before, in more agencies and for it to be more accepted. And I think that it has to be both one of many different types of offerings that there are for individuals. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think mindfulness is great. You think mindfulness is not for everybody, right? Like,
Right.
I did a workshop recently, and one of the attendees said afterwards, like, this was great, but like, I don't know if I can really see myself like sitting down to do this on a regular basis. Like, what if I just like, she's like, I'm a runner. Like, what if I just go run and like, sometimes I run without music or a podcast and I just like, don't have something in my ear while I'm running. And I'm like, go do that then. Go do that
Yeah.
then. Don't force yourself to do something different. Like that's mindfulness, right? Or even you were talking about before, like, weightlifting in the gym. It's like, I mean, you really can bring mindfulness to any activity. So it's like, okay,
True.
if you're weightlifting in the gym, like notice like where's your head going, right? Like are you feeling like you need to be distracted or you're trying to multitask all the time by like listening to a podcast or taking a I don't know, some people take phone calls while they work out even
Yeah.
like are you trying to do multiple things or are you really paying attention to like what's going on in your body when you're working out? So I mean, I encourage people to try the more formal practice, but again, it's not going to be for everybody. I think, you can't really force it on people, but I think providing a good environment for people to try it is awesome. I think more people will find that it has value than maybe they would think. I also think that we can't just, whether it's mindfulness or anything else, I feel so strongly that you can't just equip officers with as individuals with resources for preventing or managing stress. It's a great thing to do. It's not sufficient, right? I think at the organization level, always you need to be looking at what can we do, at a policy and practice level, like, we're talking about supervisor trainings. What can we do at these higher levels to, where possible, reduce stress at the source? To have more supportive policies and practices, because otherwise you're just, even though these are tools that are really helpful for people, at the end of the day, you're still putting all of the onus on officers who may not feel like they have the time to engage in another thing, right? Or maybe too tired or whatever it is. Um, I learned in my mindfulness classes, like you can bring mindfulness to any moment and situation. It's also really hard to be mindful when you're like constantly fatigued or
Mhm.
under super high levels of stress or in a toxic environment. It's just harder to do, right? I think we've all experienced that. It's like, I'm too busy to be freaking mindful. I'm just trying to do 10,000 things at once. Like, if you're trying to multitask, you sort of like inherently can't be mindful, right? So it's like, can we make people's workload more manageable? Right? It's like, so I think it has to be both, and mindfulness practice needs to be something that's thought of as an individual sort of practice that people can implement. And how can we have mindful policies and practices? How can we have mindful leadership and supervision in ways that reinforce these things and are not just giving strategies to the individual? So that's my hope.
Well, and that actually ties into another episode that of the podcast on that we talked where we talked about trauma and trauma informed agencies, and how agencies that are just trying to implement trauma informed interviewing of victims and survivors of different types of crimes. If that's all you're doing, then you're not really being trauma informed, right? You're just for a very specific purpose. But a trauma informed agency addresses trauma of all kinds throughout the agency, not just with witnesses and victims and that come in. It's with your officers too, your staff, your dispatchers, your your crime scene techs, everybody. And it's about implementing those sorts of changes throughout the agency and changing the culture of the agency to be trauma informed. And if you do that, you'll have a better workforce and a more resilient workforce. One that, I mean, a lot of your work has been, that I know, around like recruitment and retention work, for example, of police officers. I mean, if you have a workforce that is relatively happy, and that the culture is supportive, and that they have a leader they trust, and all of these sorts of things that all goes into retention of officers and helping with recruitment efforts too. And younger generations, I mean, they want to see these things, and they don't just want it to be performative where you talk about these things, but you don't actually implement them or do them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah,
I learned a lot from you over the years on this topic. So
well, it's so true though. And I mean, I love this though, because this is one of the things I wish more agencies knew. It's like your wellness issues are your retention issues, are your recruitment issues. They're all the same, right? And I think some agencies do know this, maybe not explicitly, but it's like, that's exactly it. It's like the things when people can't manage stress and it gets to be too much, that's why people are leaving. And you're right. I mean, we did some work on understanding career pathways into policing. And I mean, younger people told us, concerns about mental health were at the top of the list. And they want to see, right, not just what programs are you offering that people can elect to participate in, but like, what are you doing at the structural and organizational levels to really support people throughout their careers? So yeah, I would like to see us develop out a mindfulness program for law enforcement that really does address all the different levels, right? Like mindfulness practices, which that already exists, right? There are people out there doing great interventions where officers can learn mindfulness. And, I mentioned the mindfulness-based resilience training that exists. I think if we can also build in mindful supervision, mindful leadership, mindful policies, right? Like all of that together, I think would have much, much more of an impact. So I don't know. Like I think we came up with 5 different ideas for new research projects. So this might be one of them for me.
Yeah. No, I think it would be fascinating to build that and see how that works in an agency. And like you said, I mean, I don't want to paint it with a broad brush either, where everybody, where nobody's doing this or, nobody's doing that. But there aren't enough, it's not widespread enough yet, where we can really say that, this is something that, agencies are definitely doing, 100%. It's nothing like that. And, we'll never get to that point. But if enough agencies are doing it, and seeing results and, making sure, because, if this is the other part of it too, right? Where it is all tied together. It's not necessarily all these little buckets, right? It's all one thing, right? Where if we have officers who want to be at work, they want to come to work, they feel supported, they feel taken care of, you're going to have community members then that it's a trickle down effect, right? Where community members then feel more supported and taken care of and safe, that they can approach officers, because when they go to the officers, either they're not having a bad day because they everything's going great, but even if they are having a bad day, they understand and can process that bad day, and maybe they shift that call to another officer, or they're present enough to say like, hey, I can't take this call today, can you take this one? I'll take your next call of a different type, that isn't going to have that same impact on me. And it's not always that easy. I don't mean to say that it is. Staffing is obviously a challenge, but it is all a trickle down, and it all impacts, each area impacts another area.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like I've been talking with my mindfulness hat on for a lot of this conversation, but obviously my main role, or my day job anyway, is research, right? And so when I think about like mindfulness in terms of these different levels of organizations, I mean, it's really about awareness, right? That's what we're talking about. And to pull in the research more, I mean, it's really about data. Like, how can you use data to inform policies and practices, right? So we have one project we worked on a couple of years ago. We developed a toolkit. It's called the Compass Toolkit through the COPS office. But really, it allows agencies to understand the top sources of work-related stress for everyone in the agency. You can look at it by, rank, role, day shift, night shift, whatever. And then, use that information and then go out there and talk to people to understand more about the issues, to implement like targeted interventions that are really going to address stress at the source. And oftentimes that does have to do with changing policies and practices, whether it's around how promotional processes are done, or, shift work, if there are changes that you can make to make people's schedules a little bit easier, any flexibility that you can introduce. we really encourage just the use of data because you can't be aware of what's in everybody's head, right? But agencies are so good at using data for policing operations, right? But internally, we don't always use it. So how can you, conduct some easy surveys with your officers to find out what they really need? How can you use exit interview data or, other data that you may have access to, administrative data, to get more awareness of what is really going on internally within your organization that you can help to improve for people? And I think if you address some of those organization level changes and give some mindfulness offerings and other things, then you're really spot on, right? Because you're telling people, hey, look, we're aware of what, as an organization, our needs are, and we're addressing the things that we can on our side. And we know that, there are some aspects of policing that will always be difficult. It's just the nature of the work. So to help you meet those, in a more aware and intentional way, here are some other strategies that you can implement as an individual officer, right? But I think that whole package is really what the dream is in my mind.
Yeah, like a comprehensive program, basically, that, where every piece of what you're doing within an agency is impacted by the other piece. And I think, hopefully we'll get there someday.
Yeah.
But I think, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us. It's such a interesting topic, and I think we could talk about it for hours on end. But it seems like maybe a good place to end for today. So I really do appreciate you joining us, Jenn, and sharing your expertise and helping us understand how mindfulness can strengthen resilience and wellness in law enforcement. It's so important that we understand this topic. Remember, small steps toward mindfulness can make a big difference in managing stress and fostering a healthier culture in policing. And for more resources and information, like Jenn said, we're going to share some links in the show notes, so check those out. And until next time, stay safe, stay mindful, and stay connected. Thank you all.
Thanks, so much. Jen.